Well, yesterday I introduced another person to you that's not actually mentioned in the letter of Colossians, but obviously from the reading that I gave you out of the little letter of Philemon, he played a large part in the conversation that was taking place beforehand and afterwards. We talked about how that Onesimus was a runaway slave that Paul encountered miraculously, really, providentially in Rome. Paul led him to Christ and now was sending him back to Philemon and the church in Colossia, and asking basically for Philemon to treat him no longer as a slave, but to treat him as a brother in Christ. And I talked yesterday at length about how revolutionary that was and how radically, even scandalous that would have been in the mind of the people in the Greek and Roman world at that time. But the question is who exactly was Philemon? He was a Christian from the city of Colossia where the letter was being written, and his main name really means, it's translated as being affectionate. And we have no reason to think that he wasn't a guy like that, because the letter that Paul writes to him is very touching, it's very personal, it's very intimate, it's very caring. It seems likely that not only did Philemon sponsor the church in his home, he undoubtedly was one of the leaders of the church there in Colossia. And he was a person that we would say was really a great guy. He was a great guy. But as we talked about before, that, just as abortion is something that, unfortunately, even now, some Christians are just beginning to recognize that it's a horrible evil. So also there were many Roman or Christian believers in the first church who owned slaves and did not see the evil in their ownership of slaves. And unfortunately, this has been the fact within the church throughout its history, even though we have letters like this to Philemon. I would say that, someone once asked me the question. In fact, an African-American man talked to me one time, and he said, my father doesn't like Christianity because Christian leaders endorse slavery. And I said, actually, there may have been people who were named Christians, wore that label, identified as Christians, to put in today's parlance, but I don't believe they were Christians. I don't think they were born again, because at some point God would have had to confront them. If they actually read the scriptures, they would have seen that, as Paul said in this little letter to Philemon, one of the most socially insignificant letters ever to be printed in the Bible, would have challenged them in that concept that people can be property and people can be owned. What we assume about Philemon was that he was converted to Christ through the ministry of the Apostle Paul. That's why he makes that statement in the little letter to Philemon. He says, not to mention that you owe me your very self. In other words, Paul is saying, I'm asking you to free Philemon or Onesimus because, you're really indebted. Your very soul is indebted to me coming and sharing Christ with you. And so I ask you to respect that and to carry that forth. In other words, let your Christianity grow into a full expression of every area of your life, even though this may cost you inconvenience and it may cost you in treasure. Because something that we may not read, because we don't deal with the issue of slavery that much in our day and age, the fact that you had a slave meant that you had wealth. It also meant that they were property. They had value, especially a young, physically fit, intellectually capable young man who probably would put him in the category of what we call the house servant. He was one who had some capacity within the home and responsibility, that this was somebody, if he needed to, if Philemon was a pinch, he could sell him and acquire a great deal of money for himself as a result. So basically, it's costing him financially to make that decision as well. And unfortunately, that's kind of the thing that people struggle with. Well, I know what the right thing is to do, but it will cost me if I do it. Yeah, but it'll cost you more if you don't. That's what I would tell people. But it's also what we're pretty sure that he hosted the church in his home, which was common in the early church. They didn't have building structures, but usually they were hosted by people of wealth and property who had large courtyards and large houses that they could allow large groups of people to enter into them. Because along with his comment in verse 2, when Paul writes his letter to Philemon, he says, he refers to Apphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier. Well, these are probably Philemon's wife and his son, whom he refers to as a fellow soldier in the battle for souls, in the battle for Christ. He is somebody who probably regularly prayed for Paul, possibly even provided him with financial support. for his ministry. There were many believers who would send money to help support Paul while he was in prison, and not just when he was out on the road doing ministry, because when he was in prison, he could stay in his own house. If he could afford to pay for his own housing, he had to pay for his own food. That's the tough thing, and it's true in many places in the third world today, where if you're in jail, you have to provide for your own clothing, your own shelter, your own medicine. They lock you up. You have to take care of the rest, and if nobody takes care of you, you have to lie, cheat, or steal, or die. And so basically that was a way that the prisons were set up in the Roman world as well. So Philemon was probably a guy who was invested in Paul in a very major way. And it's clearly that he loved the church, he loved the people in the church, and was probably heartbroken and crushed when Philemon stole from him, Onesimus stole from him and ran away to Rome. But he was as a slave owner, this would have been a very difficult thing, but a very important thing, because in doing so, he was making a profound statement. And this is where I think that many times we think that decisions that we make on a daily basis are just inconsequential. I do this because it's the right thing to do, and regardless of what happens, I just know it's the right thing. And here's Philemon confronted with a major economic and personal decision. He's really making a very, very loud social statement in giving freedom to Onesimus, and knowing that this also has implications for any other slaves that he might own. And the idea that you might have to start paying people to do their services and not just get them free of charge, of the fact that you provide them with clothing and shelter and housing, but you actually have to treat them as an employee, and you lose that power of absolute control. I can see where there would just be such a wrestling match for Philemon. And yet, if he could be where we are today and realize the impact upon the world that decision had. And I believe he did, because we have the letter today. If Philemon didn't do this, he probably would have destroyed the letter, closed the church, and said, "No way, Jose, I'm hanging on to my property." But the very fact that we have this letter means that it was probably read to the entire church. Everybody knew what was going on. Can you imagine Tychicus and Onesimus show up at the church? Everybody knows who Onesimus is. And now Paul is asking him to show charity and grace and forgiveness and mercy, and to treat him as a brother in Christ. Very profound. And I say that because I think that one of the times we often go through things and we think, well, it's just a sacrifice or struggle I have to go through. But we fail to understand that the currency of heaven is so powerful that even the little things that we do in faith, a prayer for somebody that we may not even know, a financial contribution to someone that we may never see where it goes, the service that we show to somebody in our church or outside of our church in some way, and we think to ourselves, well, I'm just doing this thing, and we have no idea that God takes those little sacrifices, those little gifts, and he multiplies them, sometimes 1,000,000 times over. I was thinking about this. I was listening to Chuck Swindoll talking about Joseph being sold into slavery. And he made I thought, just a marvelous observation that had never occurred to me. He said, one day Joseph was going to become the ruler of Egypt. But when he was living in Canaan under his father's care and tutelage, he didn't speak Egyptian. He didn't know how to write or read in their language. He didn't understand their cultures. He didn't understand their economy, their government. He didn't understand anything about being an Egyptian. He was in no place to ever rule anything except his father's sheep. And God knew he had to be prepared, and so he allowed him to be sold into slavery so that he could learn these basic and essential skills that would make him capable of fulfilling the future role he has for him. And even going beyond that, the fact that he had to learn to be a man of grace, a man of forgiveness, a man who was horribly betrayed, and he had to learn how to deal with disappointment and despondency, and learn to operate in the realm of faith towards God, and not just in my feelings or my fortune, but rather I'm operating in the realm of faith. And I was thinking about that. I thought, as I look back on my life, I see all of these things that I've gone through, and my wife and I have suffered through, and things we've had to endure, and every one of them has become a building block to where we are at this point in our life. And I would just really encourage you to begin to look back on your past life, not only your victories, your successes, but your horrible defeats and failures and losses and sacrifices and things you've had to give up and go through. Broken marriages sometimes, broken families, so many things. And yet, to begin to step back and say, all of these things are not just loss, these are building blocks that God is using in my life. And that one day, maybe after I'm gone, these things will begin to multiply in a million ways beyond anything I could ever imagine. Well, I hope that gives you encouragement. God bless you. We'll continue tomorrow. Go in His grace.